Hi, welcome to Diaries. I'm Tia, this is Michelle. We share stories on how to build wealth through real estate. So be sure to subscribe to our channel below and you'll hear real stories from real investors working on real deals.
And today's topic is 5 tips on how to find great tenants for your rental properties. Now, as a disclosure,
yes, we absolutely want you to make sure that you're on point with complying with all the rules and regulations in your area regarding fair housing.
Absolutely. So, number 1, check landlord references. It's really important that when you're looking at a potential tenant that you look at their references. How were they like in previous apartments or homes that they rented at before? Now, for owners who own a lot of doors and a lot of units, you may not have time for this, but this is going to be really key if you want to make sure you have a really good tenant. So when talking to their previous landlord, ask specific questions like, did they pay the rent on time each month? Were they a nuisance? How did they take care of your property? You want to ask those kinds of questions on their opinions on that particular tenant, right? And then also don't be afraid to dive a little bit deeper, because sometimes when you call their existing landlord, if they're a terrible tenant, they just won't be truthful. They just want to say, yeah, that tenant, it's great. Their tenant, usually, they're great. They just want to get rid of the tenant. They don't want their tenant to be living in their building anymore, in their house anymore. And so I just want them out of there. So be sure to ask deeper questions saying like, okay, well, how long do they live there? Was the lease month to month? Are they terminating the lease? Did they decide not to renew or did you decide not to renew? So be sure to ask specific questions on what their thoughts are about that particular tenant, and it gives you a good idea of who you're working with.
For sure. And as Michelle mentioned, sometimes their most recent landlord might not want to share all the nitty gritty. So it might be a good idea to go back to 2 or 3 of their landlords because they don't have, any incentive to give you misinformation. So they might tell you just honest opinion of them as a tenant. So
exactly.
That's also
so going back even further if possible, if you can get those references, that's great. Yes.
Yeah. And so number 2 is look for positive credit. And so when you have your potential tenant fill out an application, they'll give you the authorization to look at their past credit. And you want to look on there to see if they have any delinquencies. And some of the key delinquencies to look for instance, is going to be your utilities, for instance, like cable, things that are pertaining to the house. Because if they're willing to forego those and be delinquent on it, are they honestly going to be on time and good tenants with paying their rent? Something to consider. The other thing when you're looking at the credit report is, do they have any past evictions? Are they a repeat offender? Is this habitual? Really understand what the circumstances were if you decide to go with someone that does have a past eviction on their credit report.
Absolutely. So number 3, be sure to verify steady income. So, lots of people have different standards and rules as far as what the required income should be, but you want to make sure that this potential tenant can afford to pay the rent and they're not going to be penny pinching to pay the rent at the beginning of each month. So I know me specifically, I like to enforce 3 times the rent. So their monthly income should be at least 3 times the rent, but in certain markets that may not be feasible. But be sure that they have a good enough income to cover that rent, whether they have it's just themselves or they have roommates or spouses, those kinds of things too. So be sure to check for paycheck stubs, their source of employment, all of that. And then another good point too is concerning self-employed tenants, right? Yeah. So a lot of self-employed tenants who do they're part of like the gig economy, or they have their own business, or they're self-employed. Request bank statements. Look for steady incomes and steady deposits to show that they have income, enough income to cover the rent, right? Warning flags could just be inconsistent deposits. That could be an issue for certain months that if they don't make income, how are they going to pay the rent that month? So be sure to look for bank statements with steady income if they're self-employed. And if they are employed, check for paycheck stubs, W-2s, different things like that, just to make sure they can easily and comfortably pay the rent each month.
Yes, for sure. And with the self-employed, if they've had their business for more than 2 years, it's good to collect those tax returns as well. Yeah. Just to see that they've got a consistent amount of income over the last 2 years. So number 4 is perform a criminal background check. Now, the reason you want to do this is you are creating an environment for people's housing. And so you want to make sure that you're not getting a tenant that has very dangerous criminal history. So you want to look for dangerous or lewd or something that may be a nuisance to the community. And so I highly recommend doing a criminal background check. And obviously it will be at your discretion or at the property management's discretion of how they qualify that and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. But I highly recommend doing a criminal background check.
Right, exactly. And if, like some potential tenants are more riskier than others.
Absolutely.
So you have to keep in mind as far as what your tenant mix would be. So if you have a multifamily building and there's children in there, you may want to be a little bit more strict as far as who comes in there, or if you have like another building that where you can be a little bit more flexible and more open on your acceptance policy depending on that. So just keep in mind as far as your tenant mix as well too when looking at those background checks, those criminal checks. Number 5, be sure to collect an appropriate deposit. You'll be surprised on the amount of people that actually don't collect security deposits from their tenants.
That's a must.
Yes, exactly. And so you want to make sure, it sounds obvious, but you want to make sure you collect a security deposit. For lower risk tenants that have very high credit scores, a good payment records, stuff like that, maybe you can charge, maybe a lesser deposit. I know that in a lot of markets, it's usually like at least a 1-month deposit you want to charge. But, depending on your scenario as an investor or your preference, if you're open for more risk, not everyone has an 800 credit score. So, if you're open to accepting lower credit scores or people with certain criminal backgrounds, maybe you charge a double deposit, different things like that. So be sure that you collect an appropriate deposit to help cover you for certain damages and additional risks that you're taking on. And also be sure to collect pet deposits as well too. So, you have your regular deposits as well as pet deposits to help cover any potential damages that occur once a tenant moves out. Damages that are beyond wear and tear, general wear and tear, of course.
So we do have another story for the Door Diaries. Honestly, with doing all of these tips, I've had really good success with my tenants. Like they've all been pretty decent, really good, but I inherited this property. And oh man, when I tell you these tenants, they weren't paying rent. So that was already a no-go. 2, I'm pretty sure they were like on some type of drug.
Yeah.
And so
you gotta love those kind of tenants.
Like it's just
the ones on drugs.
Couple, right?
Yes.
So they were just kind of a nuisance to the rest of the community. And what I did, right? They probably weren't screened that great before I got there. So what I did is instead of going through the eviction process, because that sometimes can take, you got to give them the notice and you got to go to court. Then the court has to, evict the person. And sometimes it can take months, right? And so what I did is I actually offered them the same amount that the eviction probably would have cost me. I offered them the cash for keys. And basically I went to the door and I said, if you guys leave by this day and I show up and all your stuff is unpacked and out of here, I will give you this money. Otherwise, I'm going to have to evict you because you guys are not paying rent. I showed up at that time and everything was out. I gave them money. They were gone. So sometimes, unfortunately, if you inherit the tenant or you happen to make a mistake, and it's beyond, what's normal with someone having like a regular circumstance where they just happen to be late for 1 month. If it's beyond that and you can't remedy the situation, sometimes it's good to offer them cash for keys. Right.
And, and by inheriting, we mean like, let's say you're taking on a property or you're buying a property.
Yes.
Yeah. So the cash for key strategy is a really good strategy because let's say you're looking at like a duplex, for example, right? The duplex would be a great buy if it wasn't for the terrible tenants that are locked in there for another year-long lease, right? And so what other people see as a bad deal because the tenants aren't paying rent or maybe the rents are really low and they're locked in for a long time is to throw in that cash for keys, deal. And a lot of times it's just, depending on how much you're willing to compensate that tenant to amend and break the lease early, that can turn a bad duplex into a really good duplex because now the bad tenants are gone and now you can put in some better tenants in there. So the cash for keys is a great strategy when looking at potential deals to buy that are good deals, if it wasn't for the tenants that are in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have another story for the Door Diaries. And that's a story about renting to your friends and family. That could be a tricky situation. So, I mean, all else being equal, it's probably best not to rent out to your friends and family. But I get it. Sometimes, you know, the purpose of even having properties is to rent out to your family members and friends. But the obvious major drawback with renting out to your friends and family is that, you know, if they fall behind on their rent or if things happen, you know, they can kind of take advantage of the situation. Because of course, you know, you're not going to evict your mother out of your house or your duplex or your apartment building that you have, or your brother. So that could be a really tricky situation. And so I would say, like, you know, so a particular story I had is I had a family member that I know was not the most responsible when it comes to paying his bills on time. But we still had a good relationship. So we had a really frank conversation up front and said, look, you know, I don't want this to ruin our relationship, but this is a business. So I kind of explained that up front. And I actually collected 2 months deposit. I was like, look, you know, I need an additional deposit because this is a higher risk to me because I don't want to have to ruin my relationship with my family member over this, right? And so, you know, it's important to really have those conversations up front. So therefore it doesn't ruin the relationship, right? Yeah. You know, and I think like a good tip when it comes to renting to your family members and friends is to get a property manager. Like, get a good property manager, because then if things go wrong, then they can be an intermediary to make sure that the relationship stays kosher, stays good, right? And so a property manager in the case of renting to your family members and friends may be vital to make sure that, you know, your relationship is salvaged after that. So, you know, keep that in mind too. You know, and I haven't personally been burned. You know, every time I you know, reached out to a family member, it's always been a good, you know, experience for me personally, because I have those conversations up front. But I know a lot of other people, there's a lot of nightmare stories when it comes to renting out to your cousin. So be sure to, you know, keep in mind when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Yes. And you know, the good thing that you said is like have a property manager. And if you have that property manager, even though they're your friends or family, they're going to go through all the steps that we just discussed. Right. So it kind of sets the tone that at the end of the day, this is my business. So I need you to qualify just like everyone else. I need you to treat me the same way, you know, and not try to take advantage of the situation.
Right. So, exactly.
Sure.
And as a thank you for staying to the end, we do have a bonus tip. Tia, what is that?
A great tip, right? And this may be for smaller operators, not for someone that has 100 units, because it would be very hard to do this with 100 potential tenants. But if you're a smaller operator, you have a few doors, it may be a good idea to tour and visit your potential tenant's current home. And the way that you can do this is say, hey, can we fill out the lease at your house? I'll meet you there. And when you get there, you'll be able to see how they take care of things. How are they, you know, situated in the community? And overall, you'll be able to see how they're going to treat your property, right?
Right,
like,
exactly.
Is it, you know, just the cleanliness of it? And, you know, are they taking care of their own personal items in their home? And then you'll have that's a one-on-one reference right there.
Right, exactly.
Right? See it with your own eyes.
Yeah, because if you go to their house to fill out the application, at that time you still have a choice on whether you want to go with this tenant or not. Mm-hmm. And if you see how they're living now, then you know how they're going to be living in your property. So that's definitely a great thing to do that, especially for the investors that maybe own in markets that is not so landlord friendly. Maybe the tenants have a bunch of rights, and you know, if you get stuck with a bad tenant, you might be stuck with that person for 6 months. Mm-hmm. So if you live in that kind of a market, or if you just have a few single family houses like what Tia was saying, it's going to be vital that you actually do a little bit more research in getting a good tenant. And you know, you take those little steps to do that, mm-hmm. you will be rewarded for that, you know, moving forward as far as doing your due diligence on each person. So
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you are looking to start on your real estate investment journey in your area, or you're looking for a real estate professional to help you buy or sell, make sure you visit our website at doordiariesre.com so that we can connect you with a real estate advisor in your area.
Yes, and if you like this video, be sure to like it and also subscribe so that way you can get updated on a weekly basis on real stories about real investors working on real deals. See you next time.